Hey, welcome to the Casey Hubble Show. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about this World Central Kitchen mishap, catastrophe. It depends on who you listen to describing it. Tragic in any sense of the word when civilians are killed. We are in the United States deeply, deeply saddened when civilians are killed in a conflict, no matter where it's at. But our government, especially the Biden administration, is being extremely hypocritical here. This is a war. I think the attempt is to frame it as something else. And I'm not sure what that is. What are we accusing Israel of here? It's war. And the horrible truth about war is civilians die. And we are lecturing Israel on something that Israel has acknowledged was a mistake and they're sorry for. The United States is condemning Israel for that. And let's look at our track record, if you will. The last tragic U.S. hellfire strike was right after the botched Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan. And several civilians were killed in that airstrike. But let's look at some other instances of where we have deliberately targeted civilians. Deliberately targeted civilians. Do you believe that the United States would do that? Do you believe that Great Britain would do that, our staunchest ally? Do you believe that the Western world is capable of doing that? Well, it is. It's war. On October 14, 2011, President Obama deliberately and with prior knowledge killed a U.S. civilian in a drone strike. War criminal? He's out there. He could be prosecuted. Where's the Department of Justice prosecuting President Obama? Let's see. May 19th, 2014, the Obama administration admitted to killing 4 U.S. citizens in an airstrike. Now, let's go back a little bit so we might be able to understand what's going on. The United States and Great Britain in World War II deliberately targeted Japanese civilians and German civilians. And it's not we're bombing ball bearing plants or aircraft production facilities in order to destroy their capability to make war. No. We were bombing residential areas to deprive the factories of their labor, and also to destroy the German people's morale and support for the Nazi regime. We also bombed Japan. And General Curtis LeMay, in bombing Japan, advocated and switched to bombing Japan with incendiary bombs. For those of you who don't know what an incendiary bomb is, it's a firebomb. And the reason why LeMay did that in Japan was because he knew most of Japan at that time was made of wood. Firestorms raged throughout Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians on purpose. That was what we called total war. And there are still pilots alive from that time. Are they war criminals? Should we go back and start arresting them? They were just following orders. It's the Nuremberg defense, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not condemning my country. And I'm not condemning the way we fought the war in Japan, the war in the Pacific, and the war in Europe. But what I am saying is there was a time when we felt that the targeting of civilians was essential to winning a war. It was essential to teaching a populace that it would be better to opt for peace in the future than to slaughter people. I think the Israelis, and I applaud them for this, in looking at how they've conducted the war, are taking extraordinary steps not to harm civilians. And they should be patted on the back and applauded for that. But I'm not done. In the last major war we fought, the last major conventional war we were all in on, in Vietnam, the United States evacuated entire regions, forcefully removed the population of entire regions in Vietnam in order to deprive the Viet Cong or the Vietnamese regular army units of support, of food and support in those areas. Let's see if I can make this any clearer. We took entire regions and forcefully took the people out of those regions and put them in camps, or put them in what were called strategic hamlets. We tried that once. Excuse me. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese forcefully relocated. What do you think would happen if Israel decided to evacuate Rafah in the Gaza Strip of all the civilians there so they could prosecute the war and Hamas would not have any popular support? Well, for one thing, that's impossible, because nobody wants these refugees in their country. The Egyptians have said, with the Egyptians, they're brother Arabs to the Palestinians. They don't want them in their country. Jordan has said no. The reason why Jordan has said no is because the Jordanians at one time provided relief and a place to live for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and they rewarded the Jordanians by trying to overthrow the government. So the Jordanians threw the Palestinians out of Jordan. Now, lastly, we're going to have to fundamentally rethink what war means. Because the movement has been, for the last 30 years, the movement has been to create smart weapons that can minimize civilian casualties, that are hyper accurate, in other words. And that's why. Because this civilian casualty thing, our military has become preoccupied with. Making that a priority in fighting a war, I think it's difficult to do, because our enemies now, it's not that we have a choice. You would ask any American, member of any American armed forces branch, anybody in the American military, about this, and they'll tell you the same thing. It's horrible. We don't want to kill civilians. We don't target civilians. We do everything we can not to harm civilians. But what happens when Iran, for instance, and this is going to have to be eventually dealt with. We cannot let Iran have a nuclear bomb. Israel cannot let Iran have a nuclear bomb. So what do you do when the Iranians have built 75%, by some estimates, some as high as 90% of their nuclear program is underground? And just like Hamas, probably where Hamas learned the technology to do this and learned the strategy to do this, Israel's nuclear facilities are mostly underneath hospitals, schools, and residential areas. So if we find out, let's say Iran uses a nuclear weapon against one of its neighbors, and I think Iran would use a nuclear weapon against one of its neighbors if it felt its existence was threatened, or if it felt there was a religious means or a religious reason for doing so, like getting rid of Israel. Like some of the Iranian leaders have said Israel needs to disappear in a lake of fire. So let's just say, and our policy has been, Joe Biden hasn't discussed this yet because he can't. But our policy has always been that if Israel is attacked with a weapon of mass destruction, whether it be chemical, biological, or nuclear, if that happens, the United States will consider that as an attack on the United States as well, and we will respond accordingly. I don't think Iran cares about that right now. So what happens if the world decides, and there is some agreement here that Iran can't be allowed to have nuclear weapons. What if we decide Iran's nuclear program has to be destroyed? The only way you're going to get at it is, I guess, a large-scale ground invasion. But are you going to leave those civilian areas where the nuclear programs are buried underneath? Are you going to leave them alone as military targets? But you know the Iranians have fortified them, will fortify them. There's no way around the fact you're going to have to destroy those hospitals, those schools, those residential areas on top of Iran's nuclear facilities. That's why the Iranians did it. Because they know that that's fundamentally unthinkable to the Western mind. So what are we going to do? Just accept the fact Iran has nuclear weapons? Or God forbid, the Iranians use one? Well, we can't destroy those facilities because we would impact too many civilians. Too many civilians would suffer. The point of all this is, we're hypocrites on collateral damage. And we're being disgustingly hypocritical when it comes to Israel and its fight for survival. So, how do we prosecute war going forward? When we have an enemy that knows that this is our Achilles heel, that we are people that respect human life, and they're using it against us. And now our government, the Biden administration is using it against Israel. What is Israel supposed to do? What more can they do? Collateral damage. And this is horrible. But, for instance, have you ever heard do we teach this in school anymore, about the Dresden bombing in Germany in World War II? Dresden was a sleepy college town with a rail yard that went through the middle of it. So because we were running out of targets, because most of Germany had been destroyed, the United States and Great Britain bombed Dresden for 3 days and nights. The bombing of Dresden was so horrific that we created firestorms in Dresden that consumed whole neighborhoods, whole blocks, packed full of people and refugees. Back then, it was at the end of the war, and Dresden was full of refugees. So the casualty count of that US and British bombing, nobody really knows for sure. But I've seen estimates go from 25,000 to 300,000 people were killed in that firebombing of Dresden. In fact, one British official said it may have been a classic example of overbombing. So I know all the arguments. Weapons have evolved. Our way of fighting war has evolved. But if you think about it, when's the last time we won a war with these types of limitations placed upon us? War is hell. And to try and clean it up and somehow make it more acceptable is almost impossible, because people are going to perish. So I guess we need to be more understanding and supportive of Israel, especially given our way of waging war. And I'll tell you, I'll leave you with one more. We demanded that NATO do more to help us in Afghanistan. We demanded that NATO countries send troops to Afghanistan to help the Americans. And a lot of them did it without having to be coerced. Turkey's a good example of sending troops almost immediately. A lot of NATO countries supported us immediately. But sending combat troops, that was another story. Well, the Germans did. The Germans did. The Germans had to modify their laws in order to allow German troops to serve in a military capacity outside of Germany. So the Germans had a fire base in Afghanistan, and a massive semi-truck, tanker truck full of fuel to support that base was hijacked by the Taliban. It was stolen. This is a massive tanker truck. Imagine the ones you see on the interstate, full of fuel. And the reason why the Taliban stole it was because they wanted to use it to drive it in as a suicide bomb into the German base. So the Germans located where the truck was, and it was hidden in a civilian area. But the Germans felt that it was essential to the security of their mission there to destroy that potential massive suicide bomb that would have wiped out the entire German base. So they did. They blew it up. And several civilians were killed in that village when that truck went up. The criticism was with the United States was so intense, the Germans decided, you know, we're out. We can't wage war this way. We can't protect our troops. We're not going to take this kind of criticism. And ended their combat portion of their combat support portion of their mission to Afghanistan and left. So there's a lot of things we need to think about when we're criticizing Israel, when we're criticizing this war, and there's a lot of things we need to remember about war and what it is. War cannot be confined to the battlefield. It never has been. Never in the history of civilization has it been, no matter how hyper accurate our weapons are. So thank you again for listening to me. I love these talks, And I hope to talk to you again soon. See you in the next one.
I detect a little communism. I can see it in the things you do.